From here to the stars. I am your host, Stephen Ewan Cobb. Join us in Luxembourg, December 2 to 5, 2024, for a visionary week of the human future in space among the stars at the IRG's first European Interstellar Symposium. Find out more at irg.space. Our guest today is the technology-focused lawyer James E. Dunstan. Mr. Dunstan is the founder of Mobius Legal Group and serves as general counsel to Tech Freedom. He has nearly 40 years of private legal practice centered on high technology, telecommunications, computer games, and outer space law. He was the 1978 Harry S. Truman Scholar for the state of Arizona. He is an honors graduate. He was an honors graduate of Claremont McKenna College and the Georgetown University Law Center. While at Georgetown, he founded the Georgetown Space Law Group, the first U.S.-based law student organization focused on the law of outer space. Thank you for taking the time for this interview.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Okay. You are contributing a chapter to Volume 2 of the technical monograph book series entitled Interstellar Travel, which is being edited by Les Johnson and Ken Roy. Les was kind enough to send me a copy of your chapter so I could include a few questions about it. Your chapter is titled Ship Culture and Governance. In it, you explore the possible forms of governance of a world ship, sometimes called a multi-generation ship. If you would, describe your opening assumptions concerning the ship, its speed of travel, its passengers, and the situation of its launch.
So yeah, thanks, Steve. So whenever you're kind of trying to frame what a government should look like, you sort of have to have some assumptions about what the ship is going to be like. And so I took some assumptions, mainly that we haven't done huge advances in science prior to launching the ship. So the passengers aren't in stasis. We haven't adopted cloning, so if you lose an arm, you can just grow one and attach it. So pretty much trying to think of what today's society would look like if we all boarded this giant ship and headed out. Also assuming a size, just to make it easy, sort of like 500 to 1,000. And again, that it's a multi-generation ship. So the issues that we deal with both culturally and from a governance standpoint are going to have to last more than just the people who climb on board on the way out. Because, if you're talking about 5, 6, 10 generations later, those people may look and feel a lot different than the gung-ho folks who boarded, back in Earth orbit.
Okay. In your chapter, you list a set of fundamental goals: safety, efficiency, and freedom. Talk about each one of these goals. Why is each important, and how are they impacted by the choice we make in ship's governance?
Yeah, so I think you have to start with some assumptions as to what do you want out of government, and what do you want out of your fellow passengers. And so I sort of coalesced around these three thoughts: that we want to keep people safe, we want to have a ship which is highly complex, and so the decision-making structure has to be efficient. We have to be able to turn on a dime, even though you can't turn a ship on a dime in space, obviously, but you have to make decisions. I mean, the easy one is if there's a problem with the water system, you've got to be able to just make that snap decision and say no showers for the next week, that type of thing. So that's the efficiency side. And finally, we have to deal with human nature, about what we are as people and human beings. And I think by and large, we all want a certain amount of freedom in our life. We don't want to be told what to do 24/7. You can go back to Skylab, the famous Skylab mutiny, which wasn't a mutiny at all. It was, however, the astronauts' way of saying you are programming every 10 minutes of our lives, and we just can't keep doing this on a day-to-day. And so it's going to be the same on an interstellar ship. You've got to give some people, opportunities to blow off steam, and to engage in things that make them happy. And so that's why I kind of said, let's look at those three things, and can we find some sort of happy medium between the three?
Okay. In reading your chapter, I was surprised by how many forms of governance there are to pick from. And you spend a good bit of effort in evaluating them based on their ability to provide safety, efficiency, and freedom. I'm going to go through the list, and I would like you to describe the pros and cons of each form of governance, beginning with military ships.
So military ships, efficient, right? Or at least we assume that they're going to be efficient. Aircraft carriers have a highly efficient and a highly safe environment. That's the pros. What's the con? Not a whole lot of freedom on board. And specifically when I talked about it, I thought, okay, let's talk about freedoms. How do we give our sailors their freedom? Well, we go on shore, right? We give them shore leave, and that's everything from, World War II shore leave, to Star Trek shore leave, that famous episode of the original series, an opportunity to blow off steam. The problem is on an interstellar ship under this government model, you don't have that opportunity, right? You can't just sidle up to some planet as you're going along and say, hey, go down there and sow your wild oats or whatever you want to do. Go on a drunken bender, so that's the kind of the downfall is there has to be some sort of mechanism to allow people to blow off steam and to have some freedom, and that's sort of where the rub and the conflict is with that model.
Okay, Antarctic stations.
Right. So I chose that one mainly because that's a government model that we, again, like a military model, we know and we understand, and a lot of people point to that. I mean, Antarctica, rightly or wrongly, has always been sort of an analog for space. People talk about what we've done in Antarctica and say, well, we could just take all of those concepts and put them out into space. Everything from Antarctica can't be claimed, even though there are territorial claims to it. But we've agreed not to fight a war over who owns what slice of Antarctica, right? And so we look at that model. The problem with that model is it's a relatively short duration, right? You don't have generational encampments on Antarctica. People who go down there, at most, I don't know what the record is for the longest stay down in Antarctica. I'm sure it's years, but it's not generations, right? And so there's always that ripcord. There's always that opportunity, and we routinely have to go down to Antarctica and save people, right? Who've been injured or sick or whatnot. And when I also looked at it, I found that they too have that problem of the outlet valve down there. And there's a great story I tell in the paper about how they had to bring down basically a police force because there was a fist fight that got out of hand in the mess. And they couldn't even deal with that themselves. They had to bring in outside people to come down and determine who started the fist fight type. And when I read that and looked at it and actually dug into that exchange, it was like, wow, that's a real problem if you have this government on board, on Antarctica, but it breaks down the first time there's a fist fight. Is that really going to work for a generation?
Oh, okay. Antarctic military base. I guess those are a little more efficient.
Right. Well, again, and that's sort of a combination of the two of comparing sort of the scientific communities and the military. And again, the pros and the cons. The scientific community has a little more freedom, probably than the military does, but they couldn't deal with a fist fight. On the military base, that wouldn't be a problem, right? Both of you probably end up in the brig for a week. And so I tried to say, okay, what's that overlapping Venn diagram look like between the two?
Okay. Company town, which many people are unfamiliar with a company town.
Yeah.
I know a little bit about them, but if you would, what are the pros and cons of that?
So the pros and cons are, again, the efficiency side of things, of having everything all in one place. And so who owns company town by way of background have historically been things like mining towns. You think of in the Southwest where I grew up, the copper towns that were built, and the owners of the copper mines would bring everything in. They'd build the town, they'd build the schools, they'd build all the stores, and everything was controlled by them. Highly efficient, and relatively safe in the governance model. Of course, the problem is, mining and whatnot, you're always going to have accidents and things like that. The problem with with that one as well is, how does it do on the freedom quotient? And I used several examples in the paper of times where company towns, basically exploded because the people thought that they were getting a raw deal. And the first great strike in the United States actually was at a company town. And I'll preface all of this by saying I understand this is going to be an international readership that's going to be reading this chapter. I'm an American lawyer. I grew up in America, and so I do have sort of a U.S. lens on some of these things, and plus my prior experience growing up in the Southwest and seeing the sort of the remnants of those company towns. There are company towns all over the world. Some to better, an awful lot to a badder degree. I mean, you go to China, there are company towns. You go to sub-Saharan Africa, the mines there. We're seeing now the cobalt mines, with the pictures of young children mining cobalt in basically almost a slave labor type. And so the question is, okay, does a company town kind of fit into this? And why would that work? Why would that even be considered as a model in an interstellar ship? Well, it is possible, if we're thinking 100 years or 200 years in the future, when it's possible to actually build a vehicle that could go interstellar. The billionaires of today may be trillionaires. Elon Musk's great granddaughter, might be a trillionaire. And so this trip could be footed by an individual or a corporation or a company. And therefore we can't rule out that they would say, this is my town, the ship is my town, you play by my rules. And so I think it has to be considered among the models.
Okay. Democracy. We're most familiar with that one.
Yeah, we certainly in the West are. And the famous saying, which wasn't really saying, was, I guess, Winston Churchill supposedly said, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. And democracy is messy. Yes, as we're all living through in the United States right now, obviously. We're in a very messy time in a democracy. But I think a lot of Westerners and a lot of Americans, and believe me, I've been to lots of space conferences and talking, I spent a lot of my career talking to people, and they pretty much just go in with the assumption that it's going to be very sort of libertarian, it's going to be very free, people are going to be able to do what they want. And I often have to burst their bubble and say, wow, there's lots of things we're not going to be able to. And as sort of a backdrop, I actually did a paper back in the 90s called Will the Bill of Rights Survive a Trip to the Moon? And what I did was took a look at the 10 First Amendments to the Constitution, right to free speech, right to bear arms, et cetera, and said, how's that going to work going forward? And so I even began this paper kind of revisiting that, and suddenly realized, wow, that's going to be way too constricting to think about, because there are going to be a lot of readers and a lot of people from a lot of different places who are not going to assume that it would be a democracy. And it's not like you start with democracy and riff off of that. Democracy's got to win over the hearts and minds of the generational shift as much as any other. And so it shouldn't have a leg up, even though that's the form of government that we, in the United States at least, are used to for 200, almost 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Communes. I
Yeah.
associate communes with hippies because I was a little kid in the '60s, even though
You,
I knew almost nothing about communes because I'm a little kid.
yeah,
But
exactly.
yeah, but
Yeah.
communes is one a possible form of governance.
Yeah, and I had to put it in there because, again, sort of the counterpoint to all the people that I've grown up with and known are saying it's going to be a libertarian-based democracy. The pushback on it is no, it's just going to be a commune. It's going to be one gigantic multi-generational Burning Man in space, and we're just going to have a great time for 1,000 years, going through the stars. The problem with that is if you start looking historically about how long communes generally last, it's pretty short. I mean, most communes ultimately, you either lose the father figure, or he kills you, like Jim Jones does, or the people get fed up, and realizing that all that freedom isn't quite as good, or isn't quite as efficient, or isn't quite as safe as they thought it was going to be,
Mm-hmm.
or the people you end up allowing to govern you, even in a commune, their freedom doesn't match your freedom. And
Ah.
so, historically, communes haven't fared very well. And I go through and I look at some of again, from a Western United States perspective, the juxtaposition of Jamestown versus, the Plymouth colony type of thing, the difference between, a commune type, which Jamestown kind of ended up because everybody just said, I'm going to do what I want down here. I'm going to go find all this gold that the people who signed me up or shanghaied me back in England promised me was going to be there. And Jamestown fell apart. And as opposed to the Plymouth Compact, the Mayflower Compact that we hopefully learned about in school, about people saying we are we are putting our thumbs on this document, and agreeing to be governed, and we have these sort of these tenets that we are going to abide by, and it's not just a free for all. Everybody do what they want.
Mm-hmm. Um, I noticed you did not mention the governance used on cruise ships. Is this because it's really the same as military ships, but the passengers don't notice because it's hidden from them?
Yeah, I would say that's exactly right. And again, the problem with cruise ships is, unless you're incredibly wealthy and just stay on the cruise ship, cruise after cruise after cruise, it's a very short duration. It's a week, it's 2 weeks, it's whatever time it is. And so you can put up with a lot of stuff, for a week on a cruise that you don't like, simply because you're getting great food, and the scenery's great, right?
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. I mean, a cruise ship is essentially a military ship. It just has lots of passengers on board.
Okay. Okay. Let me move to a few space questions.
Sure.
Who owns right now the cubic miles of water ice near the moon's south pole in the shaded valleys where the sun has not shed its warmth for billions of years? What laws govern there? Will it depend on whether the ships that land there are flying the American flag or the Chinese flag? And how much of it can they claim? All that lies within a mile of their craft or within 100 miles?
Sure. Okay. So, I don't want to go into space law 101, but I have to a little bit.
Okay.
But your question essentially shows a very clear tension in two of the provisions of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which is the basic international treaty that governs outer space. So, Article 2 says that no celestial body can be claimed by any nation or by proxy by any individual of any nation. So the simple answer to your question is no one knows, that. Now, we start quickly getting into the weeds here, and two Latin terms. Is it res nullius? Is it a thing that no one owns, or is it res communis? Is it a thing that everyone owns? And there's still that tension, after all these years in outer space law. I'm a res nullius person. I'm one who's saying that nobody owns that water ice, and I think that's evidenced by the fact that we have the Outer Space Treaty. most countries have rejected the Moon Treaty, which was a follow-on treaty in 1979, which essentially said that everything is the common heritage of mankind and therefore owned by all of mankind. Res communis. And so, I stick with the sort of, we've only got the Outer Space Treaty, so it's res nullius, no one owns that. Now, to answer the second part of your question, how much of that can I claim? In Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, however, it says that people have to be free to be able to use and exploit on a non-interference basis. And so the idea is, and it really will come, when the rubber hits the road down at the South Pole of the Moon, the question is, what is interference and how much area around myself do I need? So I'm the first mover. I'm the first guy there that lands on Shackleton. Or better yet, I'm the first guy there that lands on the down ramp from Shackleton down into the crater. You've ever looked at the topography, even though it's really bad and it's not true, there appears to be one really good way of getting down into the big crater into Shackleton. Now, if I land there, can I then say, okay, nobody else gets to come by here, because if you do, you're going to kick up dust on my solar panels, you're going to interfere with my communications or whatnot. And that's the next real battleground in my mind about a space law, is what happens to the second person who comes down there and lands. Are you going to be able to just wave at them as you drive around them down into Shackleton? Are they going to be able to put up a toll booth? Are they going to be able to say, no, you can't go driving by me because my non-interference zone is X kilometers around and the ramp is X minus Y. So there's only room for one of us on this down ramp into Shackleton, and it's me. I got here first. And that's going to be the real next battlefield for us, I think, from a legal standpoint, hopefully not a military standpoint.
Okay. And for the audience, the ramp downward, or the rim of the crater, is important because you need sunlight to be able to gather energy, and there's no sunlight in the bottom of the crater. That's why there's ice down there.
But that's right. But as we just saw with the Japanese Slim lander, which ended up sort of use the French ass over tea kettle. It landed on a slope. Well, the slopes on the moon are actually bigger than you think they are, and that's one of the big problems that we've got. Is one, we don't have a good map of the moon. We simply don't. We don't have a digital elevation map of the moon like we do of Earth, or even that we do of Mars. We've never sent a really good map of it. The second problem, and we found it on Apollo, is the human eyes, by biology, are designed to operate on the surface of the Earth, right? The surface of the Earth, the horizon is about 20 miles away. On the moon, it's like a mile away. And so the moon is much more curved and yet the human eye doesn't understand that, because we are biologically trained to assume that we can walk, and not fall off the edge. We don't feel that curvature as we do. And actually, if you go back and look at the Apollo 15, that was the first Apollo mission that had a rover on it, and they're driving around, and there's a famous story that's now, since they've released the full logs of that mission, Jim Irwin, Paul astronaut, almost flipped the rover because he was on a slope and he was turning into the slope, and it wasn't just the slope; it was slope versus his eye. His eye view of the horizon were wrong, and it was a much steeper slope than he felt like it was. Also in the lunar gravity, and so slopes are important on the moon. So yes, we need to get the light down in there, the power, but we've also got to be able to traverse, and traversing the South Pole. I think everybody is underestimating what it's going to take to do that.
Okay. If someday people land on Mars, how much land can they claim? If it looks like they are the only people that are ever going to go there, can they claim the entire planet for their nation? By the way, have we signed, and what nations have not signed, the space treaty that you mentioned?
So the Outer Space Treaty, I think it's 168 nations. So Article 2 still applies. You can't claim it.
Okay.
Period. I think only 16 nations have signed the Moon Treaty, and none of the major spacefaring nations. But the same rules still apply there. You can't claim all of Mars. You can't technically even claim anywhere around you other than the area you need on a non-interference basis.
Okay.
You know, so very, very, very unclear. Now, the next question you're going to ask, hopefully, so I'll answer it now, is,
Okay.
well, does that mean that I can't use the resources that are under my feet? Because obviously, if we're going to go to Mars or even go to the moon on Mars, we're going to have to do in situ, resource mining, right? We're going to have to get oxygen, from the water ice on the moon. We're going to have to get, oxygen out of the air, process carbon dioxide and whatnot in the Martian atmosphere. And I think everybody is in pretty much agreement that you can use the resources. You just can't claim all the land that's around.
Okay.
And that's why. Now, there are some outliers. There are some people who actually say, no, you don't even get to use the resources. You have to get permission before you can dig up that ice.
Permission from who?
Yes, that's the key point, and that's why the Moon Treaty was never adopted. Is because the Moon Treaty would have established under the United Nations a governing body which would have made these decisions, and by the way, would have taxed you for going and using resources in the outer space. You would have had to pay into this giant till, all the value, and then they would give you back a certain percentage of it. Yeah, and that's why the Moon Treaty never took off.
So we've talking about two different treaties. There's a space treaty
Yes.
and the Moon Treaty, two different treaties that, and the space treaty have all of the spacefaring nations signed it?
Yes, yeah. Yes, all of the major spacefaring nations signed it. The problem now is, and I did this study a number of years ago, so the number's probably more. There are almost 100 nations who now have a satellite or some interest in space. So it's not just the United States, Russia, China, India, Japan. Everybody has an interest in space because they've all got hardware up there. So it is. So when you talk about spacefaring nations, it's a much bigger tent than we think of, or certainly at the time of Apollo or when the treaties were entered into. So lots of people, but basically all of them are signatories to that. But it's interesting because we talked about the Outer Space Treaty here and the Moon Treaty there, which by the way is only 12 years difference between them. All of that treaty work got done in 12 years, 1967 to 1979 was the Outer Space Treaty, 12 years. Well, there were a couple of other treaties in between. There's the Rescue Astronaut Treaties, there's the Liability Convention, and then there's the Registration Convention. And that's a really interesting one, 1975, the Registration Convention, because a number of countries that signed the Outer Space Treaty haven't signed on to the Registration Convention. And here's why that's important. It especially is becoming more and more important now because you've got all these nations with satellites up. Well, who's responsible for it? Well, according to the UN, it's who registered them on the registry. Well, some countries aren't members to that. And there was a really good example of that just a couple of years ago of a company that went to Papua New Guinea and got their license to do outer space stuff from Papua New Guinea. Now, Papua New Guinea is a signatory to the Outer Space Treaty, but they're not a signatory to the Registration Convention. So the question is, who's going to register the space object if Papua New Guinea isn't going to do it? And so there was a big fight. I wrote an op-ed, on this, basically said, okay, who's going to sign up to a $10 billion liability, if this particular vehicle was going to be a very, very large, the largest communication satellite ever put into low Earth orbit. And what happens if that crashes into something else? and you're licensed by Papua New Guinea. And so all sorts of things, and it came up in the context of this company, which was a U.S. company, by the way, came to the FCC, Federal Communications Commission, to get frequencies. And I wrote a letter, with my Tech Freedom hat on, saying, you probably shouldn't grant this license because if there's ever an accident, there's nobody to look to, because governments ultimately, in fact, Space Law 101, under Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, are liable for the activities of their individuals and companies. And so if nobody is signing up to that liability because they're not going to register this vehicle, oops, what's going to happen? Now, that's since sort of been resolved. The company found another place to go get licensed other than the United States. And that's a whole different story for a different day. But this matters. And so, who signed on to what treaty can become important.
Okay. Which also kind of emphasizes the messiness of democracy.
Yes, absolutely.
It's very complicated. No, my next question was not that, but that was a good answer to the question that I could have asked. No, my next question is, and what about an asteroid for the purpose of mining? Can a single nation or corporation claim that?
Well, I answered that.
That's true. But if it's a small, asteroid.
Right. If it's a small asteroid, yeah, you can go out there and you can chew it up. And there's not going to be anything less. Have you effectively then, grabbed the whole thing? Yes. The more interesting question becomes, what if you have a larger asteroid, which you're mining on the south side, and somebody silos up and starts mining on the north side. Now we get back into that Article 9 interference issue, and that's going to be a very interesting question, because at some point, obviously, if I'm chewing away at the south side and somebody's chewing away at the north side, eventually you're right.
Lady, you're gonna kiss,
Lady in the Tramp,
right.
spaghetti, we're gonna kiss. Or more likely, you're going to start destabilizing, right? Because as you start chewing off pieces of it, at some point it's just going to break up. Who's responsible for that breakup? So that's going to be, that's going to keep us space lawyers fully employed in another, hopefully.
It sounds to me, based on everything you've said, that possession is what you've ground up and you're changed into something else. You basically mined it, now you own it.
Yes, and that's what the United States did. We have a domestic law that was passed in 2015, recognizing the rights to actually extract resources from an asteroid or from the moon, and that which you own, that which you use, you then own. And by the way, there's good precedent for that. We have 840 pounds of lunar material we brought back from Apollo, right? And they're all sitting in a vault in Houston. And by the way, we've only used 10% of that. So if you do the math, we actually don't have to go back to the moon for another 500 years if you use that math. Which is why I did an op-ed years ago, entitled "Free the Rocks." My argument was, let's just get rid of all our Apollo samples, then we'll have a reason to go back. Because we'll be out of samples. But understand that the United States claims those, that 840 pounds as U.S. property. Okay, they didn't turn it over to the United Nations. And the Soviets brought back a very small amount on their return mission, and we swapped. The United States swapped some of their samples for some of the Russian samples. That looks like kind of ownership and possession to me, if you can actually swap, right? And so there's precedent for that, and that was the precedent we used, to help guide Congress in the 2015 Act, which essentially says the United States will recognize as property that which has been extracted from a celestial body.
Okay. Which, based on everything you've already said, my next question sounds like we've already got the answer. What about an Earth-like planet orbiting another star? Can a single nation go to it and claim that? Sounds
Certainly,
like
they can go to it. They can't claim it.
okay.
Absolutely not. That's yeah, pun intended. That's bedrock. Space law that they
Okay,
can't
okay,
claim.
okay. We have all learned, thanks to Elon Musk waiting for clearance to launch from Texas, that the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, has authority over anything passing through the atmosphere, even things without wings. Does the FAA have any jurisdiction whatsoever outside Earth's atmosphere? And if not, does any agency of the U.S. government?
There's the rub. So I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years now really working that problem. And the problem is we've never had a National Space Act, right? What we've had are these piecemeal. We have the NASA Act, we have the FCC on spectrum, we have the FAA, whose authority is limited to launch and reentry. That's it. Now, it's interesting. There's a proceeding right now at the FAA where they want to regulate upper stages of craft. I mean, you got to use a multi-stage vehicle, these days, right, to get into space. They want specific regulations on those upper stages, which would effectively impact your ability to do anything with them in orbit. And so I've argued, in my comments, no, you can't regulate those. You can only regulate those for their launch and for their reentry. You can't, you can't regulate them. And so, which brings us into the whole orbital debris problem. The problem is we don't have any current clear legislation. Congress has never told us what agency is supposed to regulate orbital debris. And so the FCC does a little of it, the FAA does a little of it, the Department of Commerce does a little of it, but nobody is not clear who the sheriff in town is on it. And so consequently, you've got all these agencies sort of, with kind of sharp elbows out there wanting to be the first, to regulate that. And that's probably one of the worst things you could have is agencies going their own way and deciding, who should regulate what, rather than in democracy, Congress tells us, who's supposed to have that regulatory authority.
Mm-hmm. Has there been, this is not one of my questions, but I'm curious, has there been any move by Congress or the House to create a space agency, an agency that's in charge of orbital and other space located things beyond the atmosphere?
Right. So that's the rub, and that's the really interesting. So there is a House bill right now, 6131, it's voted out of committee, and it does not create a new agency. It was done by the Republicans, who currently control the House, and the last thing Republicans generally want to do is stand up a new agency. And so what 6131 does is say, okay, we're going to keep the existing regulatory agencies, the FAA, the FCC, Department of Commerce, but we're going to clearly define what their jurisdiction should be so that they don't overlap too much and they don't adopt too burdensome of regulations. So that's the House approach. Now, the White House Space Council has an alternative approach in which it essentially says, that's great, we're going to keep the existing agencies, but we're going to grant them really, really broad powers. And those powers would include the ability to pass regulations and base licenses on, quote, other national interests. None of those agencies can do anything in space claiming that. All of the current jurisdiction says public safety, national security, somewhat limited, even though the agencies tend to try to expand it. But the White House essentially said, no, we're going to grant these agencies. They can decide whether or not you go into space based on, quote, other national interests, which, by the way, are nowhere defined anywhere. The only example that has come out of the White House Space Council is that the FAA would be allowed to not grant a private mission to the moon if it would, quote, conflict with Artemis. Now, what the heck that means, I mean, I can understand, if Artemis says we're going to land exactly here on the south on the rim of Shackleton, and then a private company comes into the FAA and says, I think I can beat Artemis there. Therefore, I want to land on that exact same place. Maybe the FAA should say no because Artemis is there. But someone would argue, and I would probably argue, hey, if the private guy beats the government, why does the government get priority over the private company? Mm-hmm. But that's the only example given to what this other national interest is, other than the vague, well, everybody has to make sure that we get orbital debris under control. But again, that's really broad authority, and I'm of the ilk. I've spent my entire life inside the Beltway in Washington, D.C. I've seen the mischief that agencies can get into when they decide who wins and loses. Letting the government pick winners and losers is never a good idea, in my mind, at least.
Okay. Let me ask a couple questions about your career. You wrote and negotiated the commercial lease for the Mir space station, the first time the rights to operate a manned space station were transferred. How did that come to pass, and how did it play out?
So that's one of really fascinating stories. There have been a couple of books written on it, and I can't write one because I'm a lawyer and I still have my professional obligations. But what I can tell you based on what's out there, and there's a great documentary on this that people should go and find. It's called Orphans of Apollo, and it talks about it. And what it was is there was a telecommunications mogul in the United States who saw the state of things in space, especially saw what was going on in Russia at the time because he had a Russian telecommunications company, and he realized that the Russian government, Rosvyakosmos, the NASA version in Russia, and RSC Energia, the big aerospace contractor, they didn't have enough money to keep the Russian Mir space station up there. And so they were just going to abandon it and deorbit it. And this was in about 1998, 1999. And so he went to the Russians and said, hey, I want to buy the Mir space station from you. And they said, well, no, we're not going to let you buy it. And he said, well, can I rent it? And they said, well, we'll think about it. And so he came to me and he said, I want to rent the Mir. So write me a lease for the Mir. And I scratched my head and I went, how do you do that? Mm-hmm. And then it dawned on me, okay. So I went down to the legal form books and I pulled down an apartment lease. And so I based it on a New York apartment lease. Mm. And so when he got to Russia and he slid it across the table, but the head of Rosvyakosmos, said, excuse my really bad Russian accent. He says, "Oh, where are the protocols? Where are the annexes? Where are this?" Because it was 5 pages long. And he leaned across the table and he said, 5 rooms, beautiful views in Russian. And the head just threw back his head and laughed and reached across and shook his hand, and we were off to the races. And so we did it as a commercial lease, and then I went over and obviously devils in the details, and we did all that. So this Western entity got rights, for the Mir space station. So the next thing that happens is we launched a manned mission to go, take a look at Mir, because at that point it had been mothballed. So by the way, that was the first commercial manned mission ever. It was on a Soyuz, using all Russian hardware. So it never gets any play, but it actually was the first. It was paid for. It was commercial astronauts. These were not Rosvyakosmos. These were RSC Energia astronauts, and they went up. And of course, in the West, we were told that the Mir was this death trap and it was about to explode and all that. They went up and found out it was in actually much better shape than the Western people were saying. Well, why were the Western people saying that? Well, NASA was building the International Space Station. Russia was a partner in that. NASA knew that Russia didn't have enough money to do two space stations. They wanted Russia to do help with ours. And so we came back down and we realized that, Mir's in good shape, but as with all large space objects, you need station keeping, right? You got to keep boosting the orbit because eventually they'll come back in. Mm-hmm. And we came up with an idea of flying a electrodynamic tether to Mir, which you would hang out the back, put electricity down this wire, and essentially it adds propulsion. And so, but the problem was we're going to have to export that to Russia. And so we had to go through the four-letter word of ITAR, International Trafficking in Arms Regulations, and get permission from the U.S. government to send it over there. Well, we fought and fought and fought, and we couldn't get authorization to export it. Finally, the Russians caved and deorbited the Mir space station in 2000. And miraculously, the ITAR license to export the tether was granted the day after Mir was put into the ocean.
Not ironically.
Coincidence? I think not.
Yeah, it sounds purposeful.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's see. You co-headed the policy team in 2016, which worked on and led to ULCATS, which stands for Ultra Low Cost Access to Space. Tell me about that, if you would.
Sure, that was a really interesting and fascinating. So it stemmed out of Maxwell Air Force Base, Air University. So it was an Air Force project, and the premise was, what would military space and by extension commercial space look like if we could lower the cost to orbit by an order of magnitude, by 10 times? And so it was General Steve Quast at Maxwell who headed the project. He put together a technical team, a business team, an economic team, and a regulatory team. And I headed up, the regulatory team. And so we would have these calls as we put this paper together. And the first report was from the technical team. And these were like the people who would work on the NASA COTS, commercial off-the-shelf technology. What ultimately gave us the Falcon 9. It was the funding that Elon Musk got to do his rockets. So it was a lot of these people, very, very good people. And they came on the first telecom and said, yeah, we think an order of magnitude reduction, 10-time reduction in launch costs could happen. And Elon Musk has already done that. He's already done about half of that at that point when we did this back in 2015, 2016. So 2 weeks later, the business team came on board and said, yes, you can lower the cost to do that, but they'll just pocket the difference. They'll just make all the profits because there isn't enough demand to support that cost reduction. You have to increase your flight rate, and you have to increase the demand to go to space by tenfold to match that tenfold loss. Otherwise, the launch companies will never lower their costs. Why only charge $10 million when people will willingly pay $100 million? Which is the cycle we've been in, for all these years. And so they said, we got to increase our launch cadence by a factor close to 10 times to justify them lowering the cost to the customer. Otherwise, they'll just pocket the difference. At which point I unmuted my phone and I said, you realize you've just broken all the regulatory systems. And Quast, said, what do you mean? I said, we're not designed, our government is not designed for that many launches, for that many payloads. We're designed, our regulatory systems are designed for 10 to 20 launches a year. Now, this is 2015. This is only, not 8 years ago now. But even then, the FCC was only seeing, so many satellite launches. The FAA was only seeing a very few. That's all been blown to the dust. I mean, SpaceX is now talking about 150 launches in 2024, right? Well, we presaged that. And what was originally going to be a very, very small part of that study ended up being, I think, more than half. And there's a public version of that, which it's called the fast space study that people can go see. There's also a classified version of that. Now, I didn't even get to see the classified version because I don't have top secret clearance. But from what I was told, the regulatory section of that actually became the bulk of that, because what the Air Force recognized was we've got to completely change our procurement methods, the way we buy stuff, because we can't have these procurement cycles taking a decade for a new launch system. We've got to be much more agile than that. And that's now gone over into the private sector as well. I mean, the FCC is seeing 10,000 satellite applications a year when it used to see 20. FAA is seeing, obviously, SpaceX coming in them every single day. So they've had to beef up. And so our entire regulatory system was almost broken. And I think this study presaged that with just enough time, and it got just enough, enough exposure for all these regulatory agencies to realize they had to beef up very fast. And they're still behind. They're still slow in getting things, ramped up, but not nearly what it was like in 2015, 2016.
Okay. You testified before the Senate Space Subcommittee on the impact of Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty on innovative commercial space activities, such as on-orbit satellite servicing and asteroid mining. What were some of the points you emphasized in your testimony?
So the Article 6 is that article between Article 2 says you can't own anything, and Article 9 that says you can't interfere with each other. Article 6 is the side that says that nations are responsible for what their citizens do. And specific language in Article 6 is they must authorize and supervise that. And so there's always been this debate about what does that mean? And so Senator Cruz, this is on the Senate side, and when the Republicans were in the majority, Senator Cruz held this hearing, and I testified on it. And it's very interesting because Cruz, when he was Solicitor General of Texas, actually argued a case before the Supreme Court called Medellin versus Texas. It was a criminal case that he argued, but it's the most important space law Supreme Court decision ever made, because the decision turned on whether a particular criminal treaty was self-executing or whether or not Congress had to pass a law. And Texas argued that it was not self-executing, that Congress actually had to pass a law to implement this criminal treaty. And therefore, the defendant there argued that Texas was in violation of this treaty and essentially not getting him his Miranda rights. I mean, it wasn't the Miranda rights, you have the right to remain silent, but it was sort of akin to that. And Cruz argued a brilliant argument, saying, no, Congress has to pass a law that says, here is how we execute that treaty. And so I started my testimony reminding Cruz that and of course he smiled, he was grinning ear to ear because he remembered it very well. And so we had a great back and forth of what Medellin means and what Article 6 means. And I am of the opinion that Article 6 is not self-executing. In other words, it is up to the United States Congress to decide how we, quote, authorize and how we supervise the activities of commercial entities in space. And that absent that, agencies can't just say, no, you can't go because we don't think we can adequately authorize you or supervise you. It's the reverse, that essentially people can go off and do that as long as they don't claim territory, they don't violate Article 2, which is self-executing. They can do what they want until Congress says otherwise. And so, that's what that testimony was. And that was 2017, I think. I actually just testified last July before the House. And a lot of the same things, because they're looking at them in this bill 6131, which would try to define what authorization and supervision means. And so we've been struggling with what Article 6 means for quite some time now. But Congress has got to tell us, and agencies can't just say, well, we think authorization and supervision means this set of rules. Maybe yes, maybe no. In this legal environment with where the United States Supreme Court is now and all these crazy cases, Chevron and Loper Bright and all these, what the Supreme Court has said is agencies, you got to point us to where in your statute it says you can do this. And we're not buying into this. Well, Congress gave us general authority and we're just filling in the gaps after that. And that's actually, this is the stuff I do on a day-to-day basis. It has a huge impact on space, but lots of other places like telecommunications and whatnot. And so, it's a weird to have 1 foot in outer space, but 1 foot in administrative law in the United States. But that's kind of what my whole career's been.
Okay. You presented a multi-part space law series on the Tech Policy podcast. Just based on that brief description, it sounds exhaustive. Break it down into categories for us. What are some of the main areas of space law you covered in that series?
So, believe it or not, we have covered almost all of them on this talk. So we talk about Article 2. You can't own appropriate space. We talk about asteroid mining on that series. What that 2015 law means and how far you can go, and exactly the types of things we talked about here. We talk about innovative uses. ISAM, in space, manufacturing and things like that. What can the government do? And so it's about 3 hours of the hour we've taken today. So it's a little bit more expansive than that. And then I spent, probably about 40 minutes talking about how I got into space law and things like that. So it's, I thought they were interesting.
Sounds fascinating. What is it that people unfamiliar with space law don't understand about it? And that could be a whole series of answers.
Yeah. I think the thing that they don't understand is that the treaties are the treaties, but they don't establish a government for outer space. And that's why this Article 6 is so important. And whether or not it's self-executing is so important, because the treaties they have lots of good things to say about space, but there's not a whole lot of nuts and bolts in it. As I tell people, all of the outer space treaties together are about the size of the Constitution, right, of the United States. Okay, that's good. But then we've got the entire U.S. Code over 250 years that's put meat on the bone. Right? We don't have any of that meat on the bones in outer space. And so what I think people need to realize is we're way behind the curve in actually putting the meat on the bones that we need to in outer space. It is still a bit of the Wild West. And the problem from my standpoint, from the United States standpoint, is there's this concept in international law. There's this tension between what we call permissive innovation, permissionless innovation. In other words, I can innovate, I can go do new cool stuff, and nobody can tell me what to do, versus what's known as the precautionary principle, which means above all else, don't do anything that might cause any damage. And therefore, you can't innovate. You have to have permission to innovate, because we've got to be precautionary. We've got to be cautious of that. And by the way, the precautionary principle is a very new part of international law. It really comes, it really got its start in the 1970s in the beginnings of the environmental movement, which basically said we've got to protect the planet, we've got to protect the commons, and therefore you can't do anything that might harm the planet. So it's a new concept, and yet it's taken root and taken hold. And so the international organizations that try to govern through this treaty structure, even though they don't have have really clung to this idea that you've got to have permission before you do that. And so you got crazy people out there wanting to do really cool stuff in outer space. Can they do it? I mean, I would argue that they can, because we have an outlaw. And yet there's a whole group of folks who would say, no, 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 we have to give you permission before you do it. And that's it's a huge tension generally in our society. It's going to be a bigger tension in space. And so I would argue that that's the real big issue that we're going to have in space. And oh, by the way, to bring it full circle back to the governance and culture, the conclusion that I reach in that is whatever governing model you have to make way, you have to make room, you have to emphasize the need for innovation. You have to be able to spur your generational shift for people to think and be innovative, because in a tightly controlled society, no one benefits if I squeeze 1% more out of the water filtration system, right? Mm-hmm. I don't gain anything. I'm not going to get any extra benefit in a tightly controlled society. In a free market or highly innovative society, I could monetize that. I could somehow get benefit from that. The problem is on a generational shift. And I go back to a study that I read and was presented back. Jerry O'Neill, the great visionary of outer space colonies, had a series of conferences. And someone presented a paper that laid out and said, if we're going to go to Mars, you actually have to take 3 ships to Mars. You live in one, and then you cannibalize the other 2. And on a system-by-system basis, he went through and this was 1990s technology, and we're not that much greater now, was the mean time between failure, NTMD, mean time between failure on all of those systems was less than it takes to get to the Mars and back. And so every single thing basically will break on a Martian ship. And so you need to take 2 more. And I thought, that has stuck with me so much for over 30 years. Well, how do you get around that? Okay, 3D printing, you print some components in space, but it's up here. It's up here. Your crew has to be able to think, has to be able to innovate. And the question is, okay, if I'm going to Mars, my butt's on the line, my life is on the line, I'm going to innovate. But can you sustain that over generations? That my life's on the line and therefore I have to innovate. Will that carry through over generations if you don't plot for that, if you don't account for that, if you don't reward that? And I think that's the big takeaway for me, having gone through, and it came out in a very different place from when I started, because I ultimately concluded that's the most important value that you need on a generational shift is the impetus to innovate and somehow finding ways to reward people to take the risk, because otherwise that water filtration system is going to burn out, is not going to be repaired. Yeah. And everybody does. And so innovation, I think, and by the way, is that all that different from our life as a species, right? I mean, we have evolved as a species, into 10 fingers, 10 toes, opposable thumbs, and all that. But we have used technology, and innovative technology to better our life on this earth. We're going to have to continue that in space, and we're certainly going to have to continue that on a multi-generational shift.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You put a lot of energy into getting Congress to update and reform laws governing innovative activities in space. What are some examples of changes that they have put into place? Any?
Yeah. So certainly the speed, the speed with which licenses are being issued now is much faster than it was. It used to be you would walk into the FCC and say, "I've got this idea for a new satellite," and well, when are you going to launch it? Well, it's going to be 5 years. Great, you've got just enough time to get your license. And they worked on 3 to 5 year, time scales. I mean, there literally are people now who can go from the back of an envelope at a bar. Believe me, I've sat there and done that back of the envelope to in orbit now in less than a year. And so, but yet the thing that stops them always is, well, I can't get you as the regulatory lawyer. I'm sorry, I can't get you that license, for 3 years. And so it's the speed with which things are done. The second is to de-stovepipe. Stovepipe, so this idea that I oversee this function as a government official. And unless you can fit into my stovepipe, I don't know what you're talking about. And so therefore, you're going to have to go away and come back and convince me why you fit into my stovepipe. And so we're breaking down those stovepipes across agencies to make them realize that lots of really crazy stuff is happening, and they've got to figure out how to make it so that they can, allow those people to get their licenses in a timely manner. And so we've done a great job, I think, of informing, the FCC and the FAA and all that on it. But that's just the tip of the iceberg, because the crazy stuff is going to happen when Starship comes online, and now the price per pound doesn't go down an order of magnitude 10 times. It goes down the next 10. So it's 100 times cheaper. Now things that were just not possible to even think about in space are now going to be, just put it in, just load it up in this Starship and we'll launch it type of thing. And, understand the FAA, when they grant a launch license, they also they license the payloads that are on that. And every launch has its own payload licenses, and the FAA has to know exactly. Can you imagine trying to take a trip, an airline trip across the country, if you had to get a separate license and you had to know every single person that was going to be on that plane and every single piece of luggage and everything that's in that luggage? And oh, by the way, we need to know that 3 months before you take off, which is the way the FAA works now. None of us, we'd be driving, right? We'd be taking the train cross country. So we've got to get to that sort of, one congressman has called it the speed of relevance. Agencies have to be relevant to keep up with it. That's still the big haul. That's the heavy lift we still got in front of us.
Okay. You've mostly answered my next question. What are some examples of changes that still need to be made? Are there any others that you haven't mentioned?
Yeah, I mean,
this is a laundry list.
It's a laundry list, and it is that gap of there's no agency that really has authority to do that crazy innovative stuff, and there's going to have to be, whether it sits in FAA or Department of Commerce or the FCC, we're going to have to coalesce around and find somebody that's going to be able to do that and do that in a speedy fashion. That's the big one. The other big one is we can't ignore the fact that we're throwing stuff into space. As we said, 150 launches, for SpaceX. When Starship starts going up, vast amounts of materials are going to go up there. It's a lot of junk, and there's a lot of junk up there, and it's dangerous, and we've got to do something about it. And that's the next big heavy lift. And the problem is, you do two things regarding orbital debris. One is mitigation, which is don't create stuff and get rid of your stuff. And the other is remediation, which is actually removing the derelict stuff that's up there. We've got a great maritime law analogy there. It's called the law of salvage and fines. In maritime law, if I have a barge that I lose control of in the river, somebody can just sidle up to it and either sink it or bring it back to shore, and then they can charge me for it, right? Well, in space, we don't have that equivalent. You can't. And by the way, if I then have that barge out there and say it's not worth it to me, they then own it. And so, but we don't have that. And so we've got to get in space to this idea of refurbishing, remediating, and allowing people to take control of these dead assets that are up there, to either deorbit them, get them out of the way, or kick them up into high orbits, or to grind them down, use their component materials, and build other stuff. And that's when, but unfortunately, us space lawyers are right in smack dab in the way of that one. Because we're like, oh no, under the treaties, you own that forever up there, and you're responsible for that forever, except that if it collides with something else, then we don't know who's responsible for that. Well, that's a really stupid way of doing things. And we're going to have to get out of that mindset and find a way to be more proactive and innovative.
Okay. I understand you've written a science fiction novel, which is on screen there.
Yeah, it's over my shoulder.
Yeah. Atlantis Ascending. Tell me about that, if you would.
Yeah, so it's I'm a big fan of sort of the Heinlein juvenile, what are called the juvenile novels. And I'm not even quite sure why they get it, but it's basically the sort of wide-eyed, enthusiastic about the space, but also can have some dark side. So Atlantis Ascending, so the spaceship that's up there, wonderful work by the great space artist Mark Maxwell, did that for me. It's the first rotating space station, and it tends the first solar power satellite. And the premise of the book is, yes, climate change is real, and it's really, really, really bad. And so nations collapse, and basically there are corporate entities that now take over world governance. And this solar power satellite is the most important thing, most valuable asset up there. And it's the story of a young girl who thinks she's getting into a wonderful opportunity in space, and it turns out it's basically just a slave colony up there. And so it's sort of her struggle to survive on board the space station in conditions she never thought she would face. And there's a love story in there, and then ultimately they end up going to Jupiter at the very end of the book, and it's it's close. You can see it on the cover if you look closely. The ship to Jupiter. So it's a love story. It's science fiction. And by the way, all of it is based in science. And in fact, I reference several real life 20th century and 21st century scientists who have done some really interesting scientific work that's still theoretical at this point, that in the book have now been put into practice. The idea of a sling launch system and how you would do that. Things like that. So it's based in real science. I think it's a lot of fun. I really enjoyed working on it, and very, very strangely, I actually conceived of it and started writing it as a rock opera. I'm a musician. I'm actually a French horn player. But I conceived of it as a rock opera that turned into a novel. And someday I want to go back and actually redo it as an actual rock opera.
You co-authored with Baron Souza an op-ed entitled "Space Law: Is Asteroid Mining Legal?" What was your conclusion in that piece?
So our conclusion was very much as we've been talking about today. I can go to the asteroid. And by the way, Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty says that space is free to explore and use. And the and use is important because it means we can do more than just go out and explore. We can do more than just Apollo missions. We can actually use space. But Article 2 says you can't own it. And so where do you thread that line of it? And so the op-ed said, yeah, you can go and you can go grab an asteroid. You can't claim it, but you can chew it up and take all the valuable resources out of it. And nothing in the treaty regime says you can't. And that ultimately is what Congress sort of decided as well in the 2015 Act. And so that was the basis of that, and I'm pleased where we ended up.
Okay. You also co-authored with Ben Souza an op-ed entitled "How the U.S. Can Lead the Way to Extraterrestrial Land Deals." What were some of the ideas you put forth in that paper?
So again, it was the same concept: use but not own.
Mhm.
So because there's a large contingent of people who think that without actual real property ownership, that we can never go out into space, that you need the equivalent of what we have in the United States, which is land ownership. An awful lot of wealth has been made on the surface of the earth by owning the land. And so people say, well, if you don't have that in space, you can never go out because it'll never be profitable. And we argue against that, that you don't need real property rights. What you need is something akin to that. And by the way, land ownership created the wealth of 2, 3, 4, 5 generations ago. But one generation ago, and now, and the future generations, their wealth is being built not through real property interest, but through intangible property interests. Software, hardware, building Teslas, things like that, of making things and selling. And that's where Elon Musk made his billions and billions, right? Bezos made his billions because people figuring out a way to get people to go online and buy stuff, right? There's no, yeah, he owns real estate, lots of different places, but the real money there was made in goods and services. And so our argument in that one was look to goods and services. And if we can find a way to grant you rights in the goods that you produce and the services that you give, you can make just as much money as if you were a real estate mogul.
Okay, okay. While at Georgetown University, you founded the Georgetown Space Law Group, the first U.S.-based law student organization focused on the law of outer space. This was 40 years ago, so naturally I'm wondering, how hard was it to find other students who had space law on their mind?
Yeah, so what happened there was, and very quickly, I always pose this as a funny thing happened on the way to Wall Street for me. And I came out of college with a political science major and quantitative econ minor, figuring I'd go to law school and go to Wall Street, right? And do that whole thing. Well, I got into corporations and tax law and was bored out of my mind. And I'd wanted to be a lawyer since I was in the fourth grade. And so this was my midlife crisis was at 21. And I was like, what do I want to do? Well, I took the space law course at Georgetown, and absolutely fell in love with it. And I said, this is what I want to do. The other thing I did, by the way, was write computer games, which is very strange. Yeah, so I came out in 1983, Georgetown graduate, and I was interviewing at firms, and I said, I want to do outer space law and computer game law. In 1983, right? And so all of these firms looked at me and said, that's really cool. We don't do any of that stuff. And so I ended up, by happenstance, at a small telecommunications boutique called Haley, Bader, and Fox. We were MCI's counsel. And so I spent, the first few years of my life working on the AT&T breakup. And doing telecom work. One of the reasons they hired me, though, was Haley of Haley, Bader, and Fox, who had died 13 years earlier, was Andrew G. Haley, the world's first space lawyer. And so here I am interviewing my writing sample was a law review article that I'd done with the Georgetown Space Law Group on outer space on the geostationary orbit. And the nephew of Haley was Mike Bader, the senior partner, brilliant lawyer, was probably the most influential person in the AT&T breakup, was this guy. And he looked at me and he said, we haven't done any space law since Haley died. You really want to do that? I said, yes. And so they supported me, when I had no clients as a young associate. But that's how I got into space law, because I went to Haley's firm. And by the way, on my bookshelf here, Space Law and Government. This is must reading for any law student who wants to get into space law. Andrew G. Haley, 1963. This is Haley's personal copy that he put into the Haley Bader and Potts library, and I inherited. So I have Haley's personal copy of probably the most important book that there is out there. So that's how I got into it. And we took this class, this space law class, and it was a very interesting, diverse mix of people. And we said, hey, you guys interested in doing it? And so we were commissioned to do this law review article, which ultimately became the first law review article I wrote as editor, trying to put together these disparate sections of this. And we needed a vehicle to do it. And so we went to the administration and said, hey, would you sanction a new student law group called the Georgetown Space Law Group? And they said, yeah, sure, we're fine. And so and I only found out in retrospect that McGill University up in Montreal, they had a student organization, and they offer a doctorate or a master's in law, an LLM, in space law. But at that time, there weren't any U.S. Only a couple of schools even had one course on it, and so there was no sort of student organization to do it. Now that's there are lots since then. University of Mississippi has a whole program in it. There's a wonderful moot court student competition called the Manfred Locks competition, where every year they take on a hypothetical space law, and they have a big tournament on it. And so it's really, really flourished. Space law has really come into its own. But way back then, it was very new, but I definitely got the side eye from a lot of administrative people saying, what's this space law stuff? So,
which
but
actually
to come full circle, I'm actually beginning in the fall, I'll be teaching a course on space law at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University in Northern Virginia.
Congratulations.
I'm very happy to be able to do that. And just now realizing how much work it's going to be to put together an entire course on space law.
Yeah. I had no idea there was anybody doing space law in the 60s. Do you know of any of his early cases that you could, describe a little bit?
It's a very fascinating, Haley was a very fascinating person, including the fact that he probably was a CIA spy. So he founded the International Astronomical Federation, the IAF, back in the late 30s, early 40s. And so he actually could freely traverse and travel behind behind the Iron Curtain because he was this emissary of international law. And he's one of the big guys behind the outer space treaty. Although he died in '66, the year before it was adopted. But he could go to Bulgaria. He could go to all of these places behind the Iron Curtain because he was the emissary of space law. And remember back then, the International Geophysical Year, 1957, brought a Sputnik. The Russians were all in for that. They were very much interested in space for their own reasons, and as we were with ours, both militarily and politically as well as commercially. But Haley could travel back, and there are stories of mysterious cases of cash showing up right before he headed to the airport to go on all of these. So there's a great sort of lore behind Haley as the spy type, which is fun. Probably most of it's not true, but makes for great story time.
Okay. You serve as general counsel to Tech Freedom. Tell me about Tech Freedom. What are their goals, and what actions do they take to achieve those goals?
Sure. So Tech Freedom is a Washington, D.C. think tank, and its fundamental precepts are: we live in a dynamic world. We have to nurture this permissionless innovation, and that governments are best when they are very careful in how they approach technology. Technology is neither good nor it's evil. If you use it for evil, sure, you need to stop that. But don't stop innovation just because you think it's going to be evil. And so we do a wide range of topics, from First Amendment to telecommunications, net neutrality, things like that. And then my portfolio is outer space, it's telecom. I do some on children's before the Federal Trade Commission. So we write comments. We write amicus briefs, friend of the court brief. The one I'm probably most proud of is there have been several cases in which people have taken appeals of FCC orders up to the court, arguing that the FCC didn't do an environmental assessment of the impact of these satellite constellations. And our argument under NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and our argument is NEPA doesn't apply to outer space. Congress knows when to apply US law to outer space, and when they do it, they say so. And there's nothing in NEPA. And by the way, NEPA was passed in 1969. What were we doing in 1969? We just passed the Outer Space Treaty. We were going to the moon. If Congress had wanted to apply NEPA to outer space, that Congress especially, the most sophisticated space Congress we've ever had, they would have said so. And so there have been two appeals. The first one was dismissed on procedural grounds. The second one is still pending. And again, we argued another one. And the FCC, to their credit or discredit, has said we may take no position on whether or not NEPA applies to outer space. We're merely saying that even if it does, we did all the right things with this. And we've come in twice now. And in the oral argument in both cases, in the second one as well, the panel was very interested in the arguments, which neither side raised. We were the only ones, but as friends of the court, we actually don't get arguing time. So they had to do it on the papers. And the FCC is like, we don't want to argue whether or not NEPA because we don't care, type of thing. But I'm very proud of that. And that's the type of work we do at Tech Freedom, is to make sure that these types of issues are put front and center. And again, to make sure that agencies have to have clear statutory authority for what they do. They can't just put their finger up in the wind and say, we think this direction is right. So we're often in court cases as well as friends of the courts, amicus, arguing that there's no statutory authority for this. And so that's the role that we play in sort of all of this in the think tank world. Is we're both writing really good, effective comments before FCC, FAA, all the agencies that you want to know, but also with our amicus, with our court briefs as well.
Okay, it's a question. This is a question I have not written down. I just now thought of it. Recently in the news, there's been apparently there's a bill in Congress somewhere that deals with the authority of regulatory agencies. Regulatory agencies have traditionally been given a lot of authority to make up their own rules and decide what is right and wrong in their specialization. And the theory has been that they are technically experts in their field. It's usually highly specialized fields that Congress are not trained on as a body. And therefore, it's necessary to give them this authority. What is your opinion on that? And what direction do you think is going to be the outcome of this legislation?
Yeah, that's great. And boy, we could do 2 hours more on this, but I'll keep it brief as possible.
Okay.
So whether or not agencies get deference from the courts, whether or not the courts say, yeah, they're the expert agency, is what's known as Chevron deference. Came out of a case called Chevron. That is now up on appeal to the Supreme Court. Oral arguments were just a few weeks ago in a case called Loper-Bright. And people may have heard of this. It's the case where an agency said, on fishing boats, we get to put a person on your boat as you go out and fish to make sure that you're abiding by our rules on net sizes and how much your take is and not. And oh, by the way, you have to pay for that person. To do it. Okay. And so a group of fishermen appealed it and said, where did Congress say that you could put somebody on my boat and I had to pay for it? And it's the case called Overbright. And in that case, the argument is, well, this is an agency that has broad authority and they get Chevron deference because they're the expert agency. The court has signaled in prior cases, we're not too sure we want to go that far anymore. There was a case out of the Supreme Court almost 2 years now called West Virginia versus EPA. That in that case, the Environmental Protection Agency came up with a whole set of rules on carbon emissions, which didn't just impact carbon emissions, it impacted how how energy stations could make their energy. It was much, much more specific, much broader than Congress. And the Supreme Court said, no, 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 no. We don't see anything that even remotely looks like this type of regulation in your statutory authority. So we're not going to do that anymore. And then on the FCC side, we've got this thing called net neutrality, which is a whole different kettle of fish. That case is at the FCC now. That one's going to go up. So we have all these cases from different agencies going up where the Supreme Court is pretty much clear and said, you've got to point us more to something more in your statutory authority than do good or do stuff that's in the public interest. If Congress only goes that far, then we're not going to give you deference. We're not going to give you Chevron deference in your specific because Congress didn't give you that. And that's really critical. This is a really hugely important time for administrative law in the United States. And oh, by the way, it's going to vastly impact space as well, because as we talked about before, you've got no agency that's got specific authority over orbital debris. The FCC orbital debris rules, which are very specific, have never been challenged. Nobody's ever taken them up. Next time somebody may challenge, and if they challenge in this environment, FCC may not prevail. Similarly, the FAA with these upper stage regulations, have they gone too far? Have they gone more than what their statutory authority is? Somebody may now challenge that. So we're in a really fascinating time for administrative law, but I'm in it for the space. I mean, I'm in it because I want to make sure that we have a pathway for our commercial companies. And that's what I keep going back to is we've gone around in circles for 60 years in orbit, right, around space. And up until 10 years ago, the best aerospace engineers said you could never fly back a first stage booster and land it and reuse it. We were told it just could not be done. The rocket equation doesn't allow for it. The mass, you'd have to give up so much mass that all you could do is fly a ham sandwich, blah, 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 until Elon Musk does it. Now suddenly everybody, including Chinese, I don't know if you just saw that, there's a Chinese company building a rocket that looks incredibly similar to the Falcon 9 with the legs that come down and trying to land the thing. Right? Well, we were told we couldn't do that. Well, because innovators did it, now we can do it. And I want to make sure that for the next great leap forward in space, we have a regulatory pathway, to do that. And we don't just allow agencies to pick winners and losers and say, no, you can't do that. We've got to allow this, because if we do that, we will be, the kings of space. And whether you like the United States or not, it's just a fact of reality. Our private sector, our commercial sector can do things faster. They can do things better. They can do things more innovative than a government-run program. And space is Exhibit A to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember being amazed and just thrilled seeing the first of Elon Musk's, first stages coming back down and landing, and then I don't know, a year or two later, seeing two of them.
Yeah, with the Falcon Heavy, those two coming back. Yeah,
it was remarkable.
I periodically post that on my Facebook page and said, just remember, 10 years ago we were told this was impossible.
Yeah.
And by the way, there's a incredible Soviet science fiction movie called The Sky Beckons from 1959 It's great propaganda. It's a wonderful, Westerners bad, Soviets good. But at the end of that, they have to go rescue the bad Westerners. The Soviets have to save them. But guess what? They land the rocket ship in the middle of a lake on a big barge. And that little clip from that 1959 Soviet looks so much like a Falcon booster landing on one of the barges. It's incredible.
Wow.
People should look at The Sky Beckons. It's a great movie. But the very end of that spaceship landing back, on a barge in 1959.
Cool. Let's see. You are the founder of Mobius Legal Group, PLLC. What's that all about?
So yeah, I mean, I was downtown DC. I worked at Haley Bader and Potts. We merged into another firm. Spent a decade there, and in 2010, right on the heels of the last big recession we had, I looked around. Didn't like the commute. I mean, at that time I lived 13 miles from downtown DC, and yet my commute was regularly an hour and a half to go 13 miles. Do the math of how fast you're going behind the wheel of a car, drive you absolutely nutso insane. And just things kind of aligned. I said, I'm tired of being a partner in a DC law firm. And I said, I just want to go out on my own. And I talked to a lot of my clients, and I said, hey, what would you think if I went out on my own and I cut my hourly rate in half? And they're like, oh, I like the hourly rate stuff. And so sure enough, I brought all my clients with me. And so that was 14 years ago, 2010. And I haven't looked back. And I just love being out, being my own boss, except for my wife. And she tells me when I need to stop working, because otherwise my boss would make me work, 24/7. But I love it because I get to do, and being my own boss, I was able, when the opportunity arose to split my time half between my own practice and half at Tech Freedom, I was able to do that. If I was still in a downtown firm, I would have had to pass up that opportunity. And so it's just been a blessing to me to be able to do this, both continue to practice law for my clients, but also now really be able to do the policy work that I've always wanted to with Tech Freedom. So it's a great, it's a great synergy for me.
Okay. I mentioned in the intro that you have nearly 40 years of private legal practice centered on high technology, telecommunication, computer games, and outer space law. We've already touched on most of that, but if you would tell me about a time you worked on computer game law.
Yeah, so I mentioned the other thing I did besides taking the outer space class was wrote computer games while I was in law school, and this was off on the Apple II, and the very first IBM PC with CGA graphics. And so I've continued that. And the guy in my law school class that I wrote the games with, he went on to become a computer game designer, and is far richer than I will ever be. Because he's done very, very well for himself. But he's also my longest client. So I've done things. So I've gotten to do a lot of interesting stuff. The most interesting was I tried the first virtual property case. The first time the question of what is property in a computer game worth? Is it worth anything? And so that was back in 2003. We had an online game called Dark Age of Camelot, and someone was coming in and doing what's called gold mining. They were just accumulating all this wealth within the game, and then they would sell it outside on eBay, which violated the terms of service, and saying, no, you can't do that. We end up suing each other, and ultimately what happened was we argued that the case had to go to arbitration, and the judge agreed. And then once we went into arbitration, we just uncorked the bottle, dumped it on these people, who then just went off into the hinterlands and pulled it up shop. But what really caused it was the blowback within the game. Once we sort of publicized that if you're buying gold from these people, understand that you're buying it from people who are paying Mexicans in Tijuana, 25 cents an hour to play the game to harvest all of these gold. You're essentially, which was absolutely true, and they admitted that they had these these Tijuana farms where they were paying kids and young people almost nothing to go do this. And so we set the precedent that in fact in a virtual world you can set up rules that say no, you can't go and sell virtual goods and make a profit out of it. So that was that was probably one of the best things I've done in the computer game space.
Okay. I've got flashbacks from early days of playing WoW, World of Warcraft.
There you go. Mm-hmm.
Outside the auction house in Orgrimmar, there were of course gold sellers, but in order to promote their gold selling, they would have orcs that would be dead bodies laying out on the street that spells out their website name .com.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's exactly what you're talking about. They had a cheap labor somewhere far away, and they were, cranking out, gold in the game.
Yeah.
And for the record, I never bought any.
There you go.
any illegal gold. Let me move on. Let's see. You were on the team that won the first cellular telephone license in 1984 for MCI. Tell me about that, if you would.
Yeah, so that was a great experience. That was incredible. So I came on board again, this small boutique. I think we were only about 20 lawyers at the time. And I will never forget, I've been 3 years in law school, and yet I have this sort of engineering mind, and I program computers and all this. And I was like, oh, I get to go to a firm where I'm going to get to work with engineers, and it's going to be so exciting. And so, I walked in my first day as a young associate, hadn't even passed the bar yet, and I was immediately whisked into a meeting. And we're around this table, and there's a picture of Tampa, Florida, because Tampa was one of the markets that MCI applied for. And everybody's looking over this map, and lots of long faces, and I'm like, what's going on? And as it turned out, the contours of the cellular telephone didn't cross each other on the Courtney Causewell, the big bridge that goes across Tampa Bay. And they're like, we're going to lose, if these contours don't overlap. And one of the engineers just looks down and goes, oh, takes his finger, erases the grease pencil off of it, and then draws it out so that they cover each other. And we're like, how are you doing that? He says, we have no idea how far these things are going to go. So you want them to intersect? They intersect. And we're like, you can't do that. We've already filed this with the FCC. Sure enough, we lost Tampa. We won Pittsburgh. That was I was the when I was second chair on the Pittsburgh team. And by the way, Pittsburgh was won with 13 cell sites in Pittsburgh. And by the time they constructed it, it was over 70 cell sites. So they were completely wrong because of it. But the one thing I learned on that was MCI thought at the time, this is 1983 now, they thought at the time, at the most, someday there would be 10 million cell phones. And someday the price would go down from 30 cents a minute down to maybe 10 cents a minute. That was their most optimistic suggestion of what was going to happen, right? Mm-hmm. And what's happened, of course.
Yeah.
There are, I think last count, there are like, 450 million cell phones. Nobody charges per minute anymore. They were so far off on the adoption of technology. And I learned just a valuable lesson about that, is never underestimate what innovation can do and how quickly, if you have a product that's innovative, that's new, that people want, how quickly. And they were basing their projections on, and it was a valid at the time, on the uptake of color televisions. That's what their research said, is it took this long for color televisions to make their impact, and based on that, and there were still at that time people in the early '80s that didn't have color television. But what cellular telephone taught us was that how quickly things can emerge and be adopted if it's truly innovative and if people see value in it. And so I will never make that mistake again of underestimating what consumers are going to be willing to adopt. And gosh, I mean, since the cellular telephone, how many technologies, where the adoption curve has been incredibly fast. Not the color television rollout. It's it's far quicker than. And so that was an incredibly valuable lesson to learn.
I heard that in 2007, 1 billion cell phones were sold worldwide. Not owned, sold that year.
Exactly. Yeah, just in that year. Oh yeah, and for MCI it was like, we're not ever thinking about going anywhere other than the United States because the rest of the world is never going to have a population affluent enough to be able to afford it. And now everybody's got it. And by the way, MCI held those licenses for only about 4 or 5 years and decided to get out of the cellular business.
Really?
Yeah. To our consternation as the regulatory lawyers were saying, "You're crazy. You're crazy." And they're like, "Oh no, we got somebody who wants to pay us, all these millions of dollars for these licenses." So they're worth billions.
Yeah.
And they said, "No, we need the money now." And so that's why, MCI isn't even around anymore. Back when they were a juggernaut and made a lot of bad decisions.
Okay. In 1989, you contributed to and edited the proceedings of one of the first industry-wide workshops to address how the commercial internet would develop and be governed. Tell me about that, if you would.
Yeah, that was fascinating. So that was the fathers of the internet, and that's not Al Gore, by the way. That was a guy named Robert Kahn and Vint Cerf. Vint is much more probably a household name than Bob Kahn is. And I was invited to participate in this as kind of the scrivener and kind of the lawyer behind it. And it was a workshop, and they brought together the very brightest minds of the early internet, but they were mainly academics, and they talked about how this thing called the internet could be used to transport PhD theses from university to university, and all this basic research could be done, and how it could be an electronic library. And the first half of the day was that, and I will never forget Vint Cerf coming up to me at one of the breaks and saying, "You've been scowling this entire time." And I said, "Vint, I think you got it all wrong. I think that's not going to drive the internet." And he says, "What's going to drive the internet?" I said, "The same thing that's driven computers. It's going to be games and it's going to be porn." And he looked at me and he walked up to a big whiteboard and in about 2-3 foot high letters wrote "porn" while everybody was out. And he came back in and he sat down and he didn't say anything. Then somebody noticed it. And the whole rest of the workshop sort of stopped focusing on whether or not how fast you could get a PhD thesis from UC Berkeley to Harvard. It wasn't porn, but it was the idea that there are commercial aspects, of the internet that we're not even thinking about. And so the study of that. And by the way, the real study of that was how do you authenticate pieces of data, and so the things called nobots, these software packages that you could put around data packets to make sure that they were authentic. Well, guess what we're talking about now? We're talking about AI, right? We're talking about deepfake. We're talking about the authenticity of data. Well, the fathers of the internet were thinking about that back in the 80s. The other thing that they were thinking about was, well, how do you monetize all of this? And they said, okay, it'll be some advertising, but they were really big into microtransactions. The idea that that you would pay for every bit on the internet, and what you would pay would be, a millionth of a penny or a thousandth of a penny. But if you did enough stuff on the internet, eventually, you would be paying, tens or hundreds of dollars a month, for all of this stuff. Well, we have some of that, today, but we don't have true microtransactions, mainly because it doesn't fit well within our banking systems, right? Because there's a transactional cost to even micropayments. So what do we have instead? We've got an advertising, run internet, and like it or not, that's what we have. But it was fascinating back then to see and to see really in one day the torquing around of the thinking of the fathers of the internet, from this is just a big research project to there's commercial aspects of this we can barely even see, and obviously we see them today.
Mm-hmm. A couple of space questions. The oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere is believed to have originated as a byproduct of ancient single-celled plants. If we discover an Earth-like planet around another star with a breathable atmosphere, its oxygen may also be a byproduct of living things. If we colonize that planet, should we not let our plants and animals disrupt or replace its ecology? And if we preserve its ecology, who exactly are we preserving it for?
Yeah, that's one of the great issues that we are going to have to face. And let me preface this by saying, yes, it is a real problem on Mars. No, it is not a problem on the moon. John Lewis from the University of Arizona had one of the greatest statements ever. He said, the moon is the solar system's slag heap. It's basically just a bunch of raw materials. And we are disserving ourselves if we don't go up there and just absolutely ravage the moon. Obviously, we need it there, for all sorts of reasons, including have nice tides in the oceans and things like that. But there's no life there. There never was. There never really can be. I am not into speculation that in the permanently shadowed craters that we may find life there. If we do, it's going to be single cell, really not anything that could even a billion years evolve. So the moon, I think, is free game. Let's go munch that like this. Mars is a different story, and Mars is a very tough question. Ethically, what do we do? Do we terraform Mars? Do we even disturb, its climate? I'm of multiple minds on it, and I haven't come to sort of an intellectual decision that I'm satisfied with. Because on the one hand, I agree with Elon Musk that we either become a multi-planetary civilization or ultimately we die. We have to. I mean, the odds say there will be another, Tugunska, there will be another Cancun meteor, or we will simply blow ourselves into oblivion because we're stupid Homo sapiens. We need another place to go. And Mars, for better or for worse, looks like the best planetary surface. I'm an O'Neillian. I think we should be building large colonies, in free space myself. But okay, let's say you want to gravitate, pun intended, to Mars. What do you do there? And I don't have a good answer for that, because it's almost Boolean. You either sort of have to keep it pristine and just go explore but never use it, or you have to say, for the sake of humankind, we've got to go and make use of it the best we can. And if that means we end up destroying some life, so be it. I'm not comfortable with either side of that equation. And yet I haven't heard anybody I haven't heard anybody thread the needle on that, on how we do it, how we both can safely say we can colonize Mars to a large extent. I'm talking about, hundreds of people, but millions of people, and not negatively impact, the environment there. And what do we do? And I'm not, again, I don't have that one tightly under my belt. I'm willing to talk about multi-generational governance models for space, but when it comes to 200 years from now on the surface of Mars, I'm, I'm of multiple minds on that.
Okay. Yeah, I'm kind of conflicted on it myself. The best I can come up with is if we discover life on Mars, bacterial life on Mars, maybe we should put a moratorium of 10 years, maybe 20 years to study it thoroughly and then colonize. That's about the closest to any reasonable explanation. But I don't know that that's the right answer. I just don't
Yeah,
know. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And unfortunately, uh, it's a rational and it's an important discussion to have. Unfortunately, it begins to get, because it could be Boolean, either yay or nay, it also is polarizing.
Mhm.
And so, unfortunately, you've got a lot of people on the we need to keep it pristine who immediately jump to um, colonize means colonization, means, raping the indigenous people, means killing millions of Native Americans. And so we can't make that mistake again. And so they fall all the way over here on the continuum. And then, that forces people on the other side to say, well, we got to do what we got to do to move the species forward. And so, unfortunately, rather than trying to thread that needle and having those rational conversations, it gets irrational very polarizing very quickly. Which is why I don't engage much on that topic, simply because I find that not helpful to you have to be in one polar camp or the other polar camp. I you know I don't think you progress anything by doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Also, the people who want to keep it pristine don't want to go, and the people who want to colonize it, they want to go. And so
Yeah,
that end up the result sounds like, yeah, they're going to go.
yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, let's see. AI. Everyone is talking about AI. Do you have any thoughts on how artificial intelligence might alter your field in the near and maybe even more distant future?
Yeah, so I have a lot of thoughts, and again, it comes with a fair amount of experience in the area. Um, Let me say this: I think we do have to return to what that workshop was talking about, which is how do we authenticate data? How do we make sure that data is real? I think that's the fundamental challenge of it. Second thing I would say, as a computer programmer, who I've written in 10 or more computer programming language, I can look at some of the code that I've written. I could say, oh, that's AI. AI to me is what .com was 20 plus years ago. You add an AI at the end of your business name and you can go get money. Back then it was .com and you could get money. AI is both incredibly overly inclusive and under-inclusive at the same time. And so we've got to be very careful what we're talking about when we're talking about AI. I took, so I have to take continuing legal education. I'm barred in both the District of Columbia and Virginia Department too. I took a fascinating course on AI and the ethical impacts of AI in the legal profession. And I was really astounded by it, knowing, I think I know a fair amount about AI, but I hadn't really thought about the impacts on the practice of law. And then right after I took that course, I had it come smack me in the face, and that was at Tech Freedom. Somebody posted saying, I need an intern to find me this article author, name of article, and the publication that it was in. And our interns kept coming back and said, we can't find it. We can't find it. We can't find it.
Hmm.
And ultimately, the person fessed up and said, well, I was doing Chat GPT research and it popped this thing out. And it turns out it was what's known as a hallucination. There are, especially in the legal field, there are AI hallucinations, such that if you let AI, sort of do your research for you, it will pop back stuff that's simply not real, and that's a real danger. And I think any lawyer who dabbles in it, let alone relies on it, is fighting with fire. The second thing is, and I didn't really think about this until I took the CLE. Most AI, what is AI ultimately? It's big data, right? It is crunching all of the permutations of the largest field of data that you can get to. And when lawyers use AI, oftentimes they're required to or voluntarily provide information about their clients into these vast storage so that the big data is out there. And so, as this professor said, you realize that you are essentially compromising your obligation to keep your clients' information confidential by, even making it anonymous. Providing any data into these models could be a conflict, for you. And so, I think the legal profession, as much as any place else, is really going to be challenged by AI because it can make you so much more efficient. It can make you so much, better as a lawyer. But if you end up with hallucinations, if you end up, populating with client data, I think it's really, really, really a minefield that we're just getting into.
Okay. My last two questions. What worries you about the future of space exploration, and what makes you feel hopeful about the future of space exploration?
So let me take the second one first. What
makes you hopeful?
What makes me hopeful is the fact that there are people out there who are refusing to listen to the orthodoxy. There are the Elon Musks out there who's saying, "What do you mean I can't land a first stage booster back? I'm going to do it." By the way, the side note on that was originally Elon thought he'd get maybe 10 launches out of a booster. They're now saying they think they can get 40 and possibly even more. So I'm incredible. I've always been incredibly hopeful. So I've grown up. I tell people I'm a lawyer. I spend more time with engineers and scientists than I do with lawyers. I'm fine with that. I'm so hopeful because of the human mind, what we can think and what we can produce. And I think we can solve many of the problems on Earth. I mean, Jerry O'Neill has that pathway. It's basically, and I said this in my testimony in Congress. Let's take our heavy industry, get it off the planet where we're polluting the planet, move it out into space where we're not going to be polluting. That should be the goal. That should be the goal of humankind, is to take all the bad stuff. Let's make Earth the Garden of Eden again that it once was, by taking all the yucky stuff that we do and putting it up into orbit. My fear is that the same human frailties and the same sins of man and humans that we have on Earth will follow us, into space. That we are prone to war. We are prone to, all the deadly sins, slothness, greed, avarice, all that stuff, and that's going to, derail us. And it's could derail us in the micro. As individuals, we're going to make stupid decisions in space because of our sins, and corporately, and as a government, that governments have their own sets of sins that they're going to want to control things in space to do it their way. And when you do that, it gets done no way.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Dunstan. I appreciate your time. It was great stuff.
I appreciate it. Thanks for the opportunity, Stephen.
That was James E. Dunstan. This has been From Here to the Stars, a video series produced by the Interstellar Research Group. The IRG is a nonprofit organization dedicated to thoroughly exploring the science and engineering that can eventually open up the reality of interstellar travel. Join us in Luxembourg, December 2 to 5, 2024, for a visionary week of the human future in space among the stars at the IRG's first European Interstellar Symposium. Find out more at irg.space. I have been your host, Stephen Ewan Cobb. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, and you can subscribe to our channel for other such videos. On behalf of all of us here at the Interstellar Research Group, I thank you.